Air Canada Flight 143 was a scheduled domestic passenger flight between Montreal and Edmonton that ran out of fuel on July 23, 1983, midway through the flight. The flight crew successfully glided the Boeing 767 from an altitude of 41,000 feet, 12,500 meters, to an emergency landing at a former Royal Canadian Air Force base in Gimli, Manitoba, which had been converted to a racetrack, Gimli Motorsports Park. It resulted in no serious injuries to passengers or persons on the ground, and only minor damage to the aircraft. The aircraft was repaired and remained in service until its retirement in 2008. This unusual aviation accident earned the aircraft the nickname Gimli Glider. The accident was caused by a series of issues, starting with the failed fuel quantity indicator sensor, FQIS. These had high failure rates in the 767, and the only available replacement was also non-functional. The problem was logged, but later, the maintenance crew misunderstood the problem and turned off the backup FQIS. This required the volume of fuel to be manually measured using a dripstick. The navigational computer required the fuel to be entered in kilograms. However, an incorrect conversion from volume to mass was applied, which led the pilots and ground crew to agree that it was carrying enough fuel for the remaining trip. The aircraft was carrying only 45% of its required fuel load. The aircraft ran out of fuel halfway to Edmonton, where maintenance staff were waiting to install a working FQIS that they had borrowed from another airline. The Board of Inquiry found fault with Air Canada procedures, training and manuals. It recommended the adoption of fueling procedures and other safety measures that U.S. and European airlines were already using. The board also recommended the immediate conversion of all Air Canada aircraft from Imperial units to SI units, since a mixed fleet was more dangerous than an all-Imperial or an all-metric fleet. The aircraft involved, manufactured in 1983, was a Boeing 767-233 registered as CJUN with serial number 22520. It was powered by two Pratt & Whitney JT9D7R4D engines. The Flight Management Computer (FMC) measures fuel consumption, allowing the crew to keep track of fuel burned as the flight progresses. It is normally updated automatically by the FQIS, but the fuel quantity can also be entered manually. Because the FMC would reset during the stopover in Ottawa, the captain had the fuel tanks measured again with the dripstick with 11,430 liters, 2,510 imp gal, 3,020 US gal, of fuel in the tanks. The fueler gave a density of 1.78. Repeating the same error, Captain Pearson determined that he had 20,400 kilograms, 45,000 pounds, of fuel and entered this number into the FMC. However, he actually had just 9,250 kilograms, 20,400 pounds of fuel. 4243. The previous flight from Edmonton to Montreal had avoided the error. The fueler at Edmonton knew the density of jet fuel in kg/L, and he calculated the correct number of liters to pump into the tanks. He testified that it was a regular practice of his to do such calculations when fueling was complete. Captains Weir and Johnson checked the figures. The captain knew from previous experience the density of jet fuel in kg/L. He also had a working FQIS which agreed with his calculations. 4344. Following Air Canada's internal investigation, Captain Pearson was demoted for 6 months, and First Officer Quintal was suspended for 2 weeks for allowing the accident to happen. 3 maintenance workers were also suspended. Following a successful appeal against their suspensions, Pearson and Quintal were assigned as crew members aboard another Air Canada flight. In 1985, Pearson and Quintal were awarded the first ever Fédération Aéronautique Internationale diploma for outstanding airmanship. Several attempts by other crews who were given the same circumstances in a simulator at Vancouver resulted in crashes. Quintal was promoted to captain in 1989. Pearson remained with Air Canada for 10 years, and then moved to flying for Asiana Airlines. He retired in 1995. Maurice Quintal died at the age of 68 on September 24, 2015 in Saint-Donat, Quebec. On July 22, 1983, Air Canada Boeing 767 CUN underwent routine checks in Edmonton. The technician found a defective FQIS, so he disabled the defective channel and made an entry in the logbook. The aircraft was temporarily repaired at Gimli and flew out 2 days later to be fully repaired at a maintenance base in Winnipeg. The aircraft was returned to service with Air Canada after the full repair. The 1995 television movie Falling from the Sky Flight 174 is loosely based on this event. The Discovery Channel Canada/National Geographic TV series, Mayday, covered the accident in a 2008 episode titled Gimli Glider. The episode featured interviews with survivors, including Pearson and Quintal, and a dramatic flight recreation. After almost 25 years of service, CUN flew its last revenue flight on January 1, 2008. The Gimli Glider then began its final voyage on January 24, 2008, as AC-7067, from Montreal Trudeau to Tucson International Airport, and final flight to retirement at California's Mojave Airport. The flight was captained by Jean-Marc Blanger, a former head of the Air Canada Pilots Association. Captains Robert Pearson and Maurice Quintal were also on board, as were 3 of the 6 flight attendants from Flight 143. That summer, on July 23, 2008, the 25th anniversary of the accident, pilots Pearson and Quintal were celebrated in a parade in Gimli, and a mural was dedicated to commemorate the landing. In April 2013, the Gimli Glider was offered for sale at auction by a company called Collectible Cars, with an estimated price of $2,753 million Canadian dollars. However, bidding only reached $425,000 Canadian dollars, and the lot was unsold. According to a website dedicated to saving the aircraft, the Gimli Glider was scrapped in early 2014. Parts of the metal fuselage skin were made into 10,000 sequentially numbered luggage tags, and as of 2015, were offered for sale by a California company, Motoart, under the product name Planetax. In June 2017, a permanent museum exhibit of the event opened in Gimli. The exhibit includes a cockpit mock-up flight simulator, and as of July 2017, sold event memorabilia. The next morning, Captain John Weir and co-pilot Captain Donald Johnson were told about the problem since the FQS was now operating on a single channel. A dripstick reading was taken to obtain a second fuel quantity measurement. On June 27, 2025, the Gimli Glider Exhibit Museum displayed the recently recovered and transported cockpit of CUN in a ceremony reuniting it with Captain Robert Bob Pearson. Weir converted the dripstick reading from centimeters to liters to kilograms. Finding that it agreed with the FQS, the plane flew to Toronto and then Montreal without incident. At Montreal, Captain Robert Bob Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintal took over the airplane for Flight 143 to Ottawa and Edmonton. During the handover, we're told Pearson that a problem existed with the FQS, and Pearson decided to take on enough fuel to fly to Edmonton without refueling in Ottawa. Meanwhile, an avionics technician had entered the cockpit and read the logbook. While waiting for the fuel truck, he enabled the defective channel and performed an FQS self-test. Distracted by the arrival of the fuel truck, he left the channel enabled after the FQS failed the test. Pearson entered the cockpit to find the FQS blank, as he expected. The all-metric 767 aircraft, new to the fleet, tracked fuel quantities in kilograms. After taking a dripstick measurement, Pearson converted the reading from centimeters to liters to kilograms, but he used the density figure for jet fuel from the Air Canada refueler's slip. This figure, used for all other aircraft in the fleet, stated the density in pounds/liter. The correct figure to use was for kilograms/liter, and the result actually calculated was incorrect. Since the FQS was not operational, he entered the miscalculated result into the flight management computer. The airplane flew to Ottawa without accident, where another dripstick measurement was taken, and again in the same way, converted incorrectly. Since the aircraft appeared to have enough fuel to reach Edmonton, no fuel was loaded at Ottawa. While Flight 143 was flying over Red Lake, Ontario at 41,000 feet, 12,500 meters, shortly after 8 p.m. Central Daylight Time, the aircraft's cockpit warning system sounded, indicating a fuel pressure problem on the aircraft's left side. Assuming that a fuel pump had failed, the pilots turned off the alarm, knowing that the engine could be gravity-fed in level flight. A few seconds later, the fuel pressure alarm also sounded for the right engine. This prompted the pilots to divert to Winnipeg. The left engine failed within seconds, and the pilots began preparing for a single-engine landing. As they communicated their intentions to controllers in Winnipeg and tried to restart the left engine, the cockpit warning system sounded again with the all engines out sound, a sharp bong that no one in the cockpit could recall having heard before. The right side engine stopped seconds later, and the 767 lost all power. Flying with all engines out was never expected to occur, so it had never been covered in training. Adding to both the crew's and the controller's problems, the plane's transponder failed, stopping the altitude reporting function, and forcing the controllers to revert to primary radar to track the plane. The 767 was one of the first airliners to include an electronic flight instrument system, which operated on the electricity generated by the aircraft's jet engines. With both engines stopped, the system went dead, and most screens went blank, leaving only a few basic battery-powered emergency flight instruments. While these provided sufficient information to land the aircraft, the backup instruments did not include a vertical speed indicator that could be used to determine how far the aircraft could glide. On the Boeing 767, the control surfaces are so large that the pilots cannot move them with muscle power alone. Instead, hydraulic systems are used to multiply the forces applied by the pilots. Since the engines supply power for the hydraulic systems, in the case of a complete power outage, the aircraft was designed with a ram air turbine that swings out from a compartment located beneath the bottom of the 767 and drives a hydraulic pump to supply power to hydraulic systems. In line with their planned diversion to Winnipeg, the pilots had been descending through 35,000 feet, 10,700 meters, when the second engine shut down. They had searched their emergency checklist for the section on flying the aircraft with both engines out, only to find that no such section existed. Captain Pearson was an experienced glider pilot, so he was familiar with flying techniques rarely used in commercial flight. Pearson needed to fly the 767 at the optimum glide speed to have the maximum range and, therefore, the largest choice of possible landing sites. Making his best guess as to this speed for the 767, he flew the aircraft at 220 knots, 410 kilometers per hour, 250 miles per hour. First Officer Quintal started to calculate whether they could reach Winnipeg. Quintal used the altitude from one of the mechanical backup instruments, while the distance traveled was supplied by the air traffic controllers in Winnipeg, measured by the aircraft's radar echo observed at Winnipeg. In 10 nautical miles, 19 kilometers, 12 miles, the aircraft lost 5,000 feet, 1,500 meters, giving a glide ratio of roughly 12:1. The optimal glide ratio for a Boeing 767-200 is roughly 20:1, achieved at speeds of 230,240 knots, 430,440 kilometers per hour, 260,280 miles per hour, and without payload on dedicated glider planes, glide ratios of up to 70:1 are possible. At this point, Quintal proposed landing at the former RCF station Gimli, a closed Air Force base where he had once served as a pilot for the Royal Canadian Air Force. Unbeknownst to Quintal or the air traffic controller, a part of the facility had been converted to a racetrack complex, now known as Gimli Motorsports Park. It included a road race course, a go-kart track, and a drag strip. A Canadian Automobile Sport Club-sanctioned sports car race hosted by the Winnipeg Sports Car Club was underway at the time of the accident. The area around the decommissioned runway was full of cars and campers. Part of the decommissioned runway was being used to stage the race as the aircraft slowed on approach to landing. The reduced power generated by the ram air turbine rendered the aircraft increasingly difficult to control. Without main power, the pilots used a gravity drop to lower the landing gear and lock it into place. The main gear locked into position, but the nose wheel did not. The failure of the nose wheel to lock would later prove to be a serendipitous advantage after touchdown for the safety of those on the converted runway. As the plane approached the runway, the pilots realized it was coming in too high and fast, increasing the likelihood that the 767 would run off the runway. The lack of hydraulic pressure prevented flap/slat extension that would have, under normal conditions, reduced the aircraft's stall speed and increased the lift coefficient of the wings, to slow the airliner for a safe landing. The pilots briefly considered a 360 turn to reduce speed and altitude, but they decided they did not have enough altitude for the maneuver. Pearson decided to execute a forward slip to increase drag and reduce altitude. This maneuver, performed by crossing the controls, applying the rudder in one direction and ailerons in the other direction, is commonly used in gliders and light aircraft to descend more quickly without increasing forward speed. It is rarely used in large jet airliners outside of rare circumstances like those of this flight. The forward slip disrupted airflow past the ram air turbine, which decreased the hydraulic power available. The pilots were surprised to find the aircraft slow to respond when straightening after the forward slip. With both engines completely starved of fuel, The plane made hardly any noise during its approach. This gave people on the ground no warning of the impromptu landing and little time to flee. As the gliding plane closed in on the decommissioned runway, the pilots noticed boys were riding bicycles within 1,000 feet, 300 meters, of the projected point of impact. Two factors helped avert disaster: the failure of the front landing gear to lock into position during the gravity drop, and a guardrail installed along the center of the repurposed runway to facilitate its use as a drag race track. Pearson braked hard as soon as the wheels touched down on the runway, skidding and promptly blowing out two of the aircraft's tires. The unlocked nose wheel collapsed and was forced back into its well, causing the aircraft's nose to slam into, bounce off, and then scrape along the ground. This additional friction helped to slow the airplane and kept it from crashing into the crowds surrounding the runway. Pearson applied extra right brake, which caused the main landing gear to straddle the guardrail. Air Canada Flight 143 came to a final stop on the ground 17 minutes after running out of fuel. No serious injuries occurred among the 61 passengers or the people on the ground. As the aircraft's nose had collapsed onto the ground, its tail was elevated, so some minor injuries occurred when passengers exited the aircraft via the rear slides, which were not sufficiently long to accommodate the increased height. Racers and course workers with portable fire extinguishers extinguished a minor fire in the nose area. The Canadian Aviation Safety Board, predecessor of the modern Transportation Safety Board of Canada, reported that Air Canada management was responsible for corporate and equipment deficiencies. Their report praised the flight and cabin crews for their professionalism and skill. It noted that Air Canada neglected to assign clearly and specifically the responsibility for calculating the fuel load in an abnormal situation. 65. It further found that the airline had failed to reallocate the task of checking fuel load, which had been the responsibility of the flight engineer on older aircraft flown with a crew of 3. The safety board also said that Air Canada needed to keep more spare parts, including replacements for the defective fuel quantity indicator, in its maintenance inventory, and provide better, more thorough training on the metric system to its pilots and fueling personnel. The final report of the investigation was published in April 1985. The amount of fuel in the tanks of a Boeing 767 is computed by the FQIS and displayed in the cockpit. The FQIS on the aircraft was a dual processor channel, each independently calculating the fuel load and cross-checking with the other. In the event of one failing, the other could still operate alone, but in that case, the indicated quantity was required to be cross-checked against a float stick measurement before departure. If both channels fail, no fuel display was seen in the cockpit, and the aircraft would be considered unserviceable and not authorized to fly. Because inconsistencies had been found with the FQIS and other 767s, Boeing issued a service bulletin for the routine checking of this system. An engineer in Edmonton duly did so when the aircraft arrived from Toronto following a trouble-free flight the day before the accident. While conducting this check, the FQIS failed, and the cockpit fuel gauges went blank. The engineer had encountered the same problem earlier in the month when this same aircraft had arrived from Toronto with an FQIS fault. He found then that disabling the second channel by pulling the circuit breaker in the cockpit restored the fuel gauges to working order, albeit with only the single FQIS channel operative. Without any spares, he repeated this temporary fix by pulling and tagging the circuit breaker. A record of all actions and findings was made in the maintenance log, including the entry: Service CHK found fuel QI blank fuel QI number 2C/B pulled and tagged. This reports that the fuel gauges were blank and that the second FQIS channel was disabled, but it does not make clear that the latter fixed the former. The aircraft flew from Edmonton to Montreal on the day of the accident. Before departure, the engineer informed the pilot of the problem and confirmed that the tanks must be verified with a float stick. In a misunderstanding, the pilot believed the aircraft had been flown with the fault from Toronto the previous afternoon. The flight to Montreal proceeded uneventfully, with fuel gauges operating correctly on the single channel. On arrival in Montreal, a new crew boarded for the return flight to Edmonton. The outgoing pilot informed Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal of the problem with the FQIS and passed along his mistaken belief that the aircraft had flown the previous day with this problem. In a further misunderstanding, Captain Pearson believed he was also being told that the FQIS had been completely unserviceable since then. While the aircraft was being prepared to return to Edmonton, a maintenance worker decided to investigate the problem with the faulty FQIS to test the system. He re-enabled the second channel, at which point the fuel gauges in the cockpit went blank. However, before he could disable the second channel again, he was called away to perform a float stick measurement of fuel remaining in the tanks, leaving the circuit breaker tagged, which masked the fact that it was no longer pulled. The FQS was now completely unserviceable, and the fuel gauges were blank on entering the cockpit. Captain Pearson saw what he was expecting to see: blank fuel gauges and a tagged circuit breaker. Pearson consulted the Master Minimum Equipment List (MMEL), which indicated that the aircraft was not legal to fly with blank fuel gauges. Still, due to a misunderstanding, Pearson believed it was safe to fly if the amount of fuel was confirmed with measuring sticks. The 767 was still a very new aircraft, having flown its maiden flight in September 1981. CDUN was the 47th Boeing 767 off the production line and had been delivered to Air Canada fewer than 4 months prior to this flight. In that time, 55 changes had been made to the MMEL, and some pages were blank pending development of procedures. Because of this unreliability, maintenance personnel authorizing flights had become standard practice. To add to his misconceptions about the aircraft's flying condition since the previous day, reinforced by what he saw in the cockpit, Pearson now had a signed-off maintenance log, which had become customarily preferred over the MMEL. In older aircraft with a 3-person crew, the flight engineer kept a fuel log and supervised the fueling. The Boeing 767 belonged to a new generation of aircraft that flew with only a pilot and co-pilot, but Air Canada had not clearly assigned responsibility for supervising the fueling. 6465 On the day of the accident, 2 technicians and 2 pilots worked on the calculation in Montreal. One technician stopped after he found that he was not making any progress. Another technician was using a piece of paper in his pocket, and he stopped when he ran out of space. First Officer Quintal did the calculation by hand, and Captain Pearson checked the arithmetic with his Jeppesen slide rule. 4041 Since the FQS was not working, Captain Pearson decided to take on enough fuel to reach Edmonton without refueling at Ottawa. 26 The flight plan showed that 22,300 kilograms (49,200 pounds) of fuel were required for the flight from Montreal to Ottawa to Edmonton. A dripstick check found that 7,682 liters (1,690 imp gal, 2,029 US gal) of fuel was already in the tanks. To calculate how much fuel the airplane had to take on, he needed to convert the 7,682 liters of fuel already in the tanks to their equivalent mass in kilograms, subtract that figure from the 22,300 kilograms total fuel that would be needed, and convert that result back into its equivalent volume. 41 The density in metric units was 0803 kg/L, so the correct calculation would have been: at the time of the accident, Canada's aviation sector was converting from imperial to metric units. As part of this process, the new 767s acquired by Air Canada were the first to be calibrated for metric units. 6364 The fueler reported that the density of jet fuel at the time was 1.77, which was in lb/L, since other Air Canada aircraft used lb. Pearson and Quintal both used the density of jet fuel in lb/L without converting to kg/L. 4041 Instead of taking on the 20,088 liters, 4,419 imp gal, 5,307 US gal, of additional fuel that they required, they took on only 4,917 liters, 1,082 imp gal, 1,299 US gal. The use of the incorrect conversion factor led to a total fuel load of only 22,300 pounds, 10,100 kilograms, rather than the 49,170 pounds, 22,300 kilograms, that were needed. This was less than half of the amount required to reach their destination.